He's back, ladies and gentlemen. He's made it back from Cuba. Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University. He's the co-author of News Verdicts, The Debates in Presidential Campaigns. He's tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg. Bill, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
There seems to be a theme the last couple of weeks with the soundtrack, but that sounds great.
It's first of all, I'm glad you're back because, this storm, Michael, was kind of threatening Cuba for a while, wasn't it?
Well, yes, it was interesting. I actually had a couple of days off from teaching because of the holiday on Monday, and I took a trip with a very close friend to Cuba. My wife was unable to go, but we had quite an experience. I like to travel around the world both personally and professionally, and being in Cuba was really a fascinating experience from the first get-go, trying to figure out how to go, which actually seems much simpler than most Americans would imagine. You walk up to the United Airlines counter and you give them $50 and you check the reason why you want to go, and they hand you a visa. It's really that simple. And when we arrived in Cuba, it was basically a fascinating 5 days. I heard you speaking just a moment ago about the hurricane, and in fact, we did travel way out into the countryside, about 180 miles outside of Havana, and it was overcast and a little bit of drizzle, but there was no public recognition that there was a hurricane coming. Some of the locals knew about it, but it wasn't something that was being blared like you see on American media, on TV, on radio, and on newspapers. It was just sort of an awareness that there was something coming or something going by. So very, very different reaction.
Have you ever been there before?
No, that was the first time I had been to Cuba. I've been to a number of different countries around the world. And one of the things that I found most striking was, as a political scientist, I often, as you can imagine, engage in discussions about politics and media and society. And one of the things that I found really incredible was there was very little public media. There were no newsstands. There were no places where you saw various newspapers laid out or magazines. If you wanted to have information on television, there were 8 channels. That was it. And the channels that you saw on television were not very political. They were sort of the animal channel, sometimes some old reruns of some situation television programs, not necessarily comedies, but very limited in terms of media today. Now, I can't speak to what it was like under Fidel Castro's period in terms of propaganda that may have been on the air then, but you're really dealing with a situation where there is very little in terms of the media and the press to know about what's going on in politics, both domestically and internationally.
Sounds like when I was a kid, there were only 8 channels, if that. And I grew up in the New York metro area, which was all over the place. So did you have pretty much unfettered access? I mean, you were able to go pretty much where you wanted to?
You could go wherever you want. And one of the things that I found actually quite surprising was the reaction of the Cubans to not just Americans, but people throughout the world. There was really very little hesitancy to speak to us. They often did not want to necessarily directly confront politics. I think that was a situation where after they spoke to you a little bit, they began to engage a little bit more. But the reality is that the people there were very much aware of what's going on in the United States and around the world, but they choose to sort of not get that engaged. A refrain that I often heard was the politics that we as Americans may have thought about was that which was largely directed among older Cubans. In other words, they were focused on the past. The younger people were much more focused on the present and future. One day I went and visited the Museum of the Revolution. And when you're in the Museum of the Revolution, it talks about, Fidel's, taking control of the country, removing Batista and so forth. And then there, the museum itself had a number of different displays, and they were sort of like talking about the conspiratorial nature of the U.S. and the CIA and what the United States had done to them. There wasn't any real mention of American U.S. friendship with Cuba, but that was a museum of the revolution. For the people on the street, they really don't really engage in that kind of thought pattern anymore. They say, we're not really concerned about the past. That's the older people. They're the ones that are still thinking about that. So
where does their awareness come from, Bill? In other words, as you said, they don't have a lot of access to news, so even though they don't engage, you say they're pretty much up on politics. Where do they get that from?
Well, I think that comes... My assumption, and again, this is anecdotal, I wasn't conducting, massive surveys. I was just talking to as many people as I could, and again, not talking to people necessarily in restaurants or in hotels, but people that I would meet on the street or when I was getting coffee or whatever, and most of them were Cubans. They weren't even Westerners. Is that there is discussion among the individuals there. There are not really widely distributed newspapers. There is some television, but I would again classify it in terms of limited sort of public kind of broadcasts along with some sort of media of entertainment and so forth. But I think there's probably a sense of informal communication. I think, we have to realize that they can probably pick up a number of different sources of information, and we have to remember that Cuba is only 75 miles off of Key West.
Right.
Cuba is not that far from Puerto Rico. That for a long time, people from other countries, not the United States, but other countries, could easily visit Cuba. So there was a sense of sort of a more international flavor than one might expect. It's not like it's the Iron Curtain, around the country and nobody could come in and out.
What does it look like? I mean, in the sense of we hear much about infrastructure issues, whether or not the roads are crumbling or they're well built, or if people are struggling to get by, that the economy struggles, et cetera. Give us an overall sense of the well-being of the people of Cuba.
I think it's an excellent question. It's a tale of, I would say, multiple cities. We ended up staying in a apartment that cost $60 a day for a two-bedroom apartment. Very inexpensive, and it was on a part of town that was very, very rugged, is the best way I describe it. The streets were a mess, but there was a lot of construction going on. They were digging up the streets, apparently trying to deal with electric or water issues below. When we first arrived, we had our Lonely Planet book, and we were walking around, and we thought we were going in the right direction. It ends up we were walking in a very, very dilapidated area that's not even on the map in Lonely Planet. Made a huge circle, and then eventually got over towards the Parliament building and the section of town that's been totally gentrified. You think you were in Old City in Philadelphia or in over across in Virginia, Alexandria, just, old, beautiful buildings that have been completely renovated. Other sections of the city where the embassies are and where the university is, a little bit declining in terms of its current upkeep, but still in very nice shape. At the same time, we also traveled way out into the country, as I said, about 170 miles outside of town, and it was like rural America. Small houses, small family farms or businesses. There did not seem to be any issue with getting appropriate amounts of food. People had meat, chicken, fish available to them, lots of agricultural products. And I think the people that at least that I came in contact with seemed pretty comfortable with their way of life. They would like to be able to travel more internationally, but they also have limited financial resources, and as a result are pretty much island-bound for the most part. A number of them do have family in the United States, and periodically if they have the resources, can go visit, or the family members come and visit them.
Well, I appreciate the snapshot and the slideshow, if you will, on the radio from your visit, and we'll get back to the regular politics of the U.S. next week when we get together again. But thanks so much. Appreciate it, Bill.
All right. Take care. One last thing I would say, Tim, is that internet service basically barely exists. you buy an internet card for $1 and it's supposed to give you an hour, and you can type in that code over and over and over again and rarely get through. So if you go down there, don't expect wonderful internet service or any type of streaming service. It's not available.
Very good. Dr. Bill Rosenberg. Thanks, Bill.
Bye-bye.
Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel, just back from a trip to Cuba, getting some information, not a formal survey, but some interesting aspects of the society there and, of course, the ongoing relationship between the U.S. and Cuba, often the discussion of politics in this country. He is tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg.